So let's begin in verse 16 in Mark chapter 15. And it's a lengthy reading, so bear with me, but try to just pay attention and really be engaged in the reading. In verse 16, the soldiers took him away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. They dressed him up in purple, and after twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They kept beating his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling and bowing before him. And after they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off and put his own garments on him. And they led him out to crucify him. They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Then they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. And they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, and divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots for them to decide what each man should take. It was the third hour when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified two robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left, and the scripture was fulfilled, which says, "And he was numbered with transgressors." Those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, "Ha! You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priest also, along with the scribes, were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let this Christ, the King of Israel, now come down from the cross so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him were also insulting him. When the 6th hour came, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, "Behold, he is calling for Elijah." Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave him a drink, saying, "Let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion, who was standing right in front of him, saw the way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." There were also some women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the Less, and Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they used to follow him and minister to him. And there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. When evening had already come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea came, a prominent member of the council, who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God, and he gathered up courage and went in before Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate wondered if he was dead by this time, and summoning the centurion, he questioned him as to whether he was already dead. And ascertaining this from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. Joseph bought a linen cloth, took him down, wrapped him in the linen cloth, and laid him in a tomb which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, were looking on to see where he was laid. So I know that's a lengthy reading, but first person that stands out to you in that text.
Jesus.
Thank you. Jesus. Who else? Who? Soldiers. Okay.
Simon of Cyrene.
Simon of Cyrene. The robbers. The men crucified on either side of him. Who else?
The women.
Who?
The women.
The women. Yes. Standing at the foot of the cross. And even some further from a distance.
Joseph.
So you've mentioned all the ones that we're going to be talking about this morning, but a lot of times it's so easy because obviously this is whether you call it the Passion of the Christ or just the crucifixion story of Jesus, we're so honed in on what is happening to Jesus that sometimes we lose track of some of the other individuals that were present. And what I want to do this morning is spend just a little bit of time on each of them and figure out who were these men. There's not much to know about them. And then why are they mentioned? What is their significance in being mentioned within this story of the crucifixion of Christ? And so, who were these three men? We'll meet Simon of Cyrene first. And as is mentioned in the text, he was pressed into service. But he's from Cyrene, which is a small town way over here in northern Africa. And so you can see where Jerusalem would be all the way over here. And so he would have traveled quite a ways. I don't know how many miles that is, but several hundreds of miles to be able to get to Jerusalem for the Passover. And so we see him there. There in Cyrene, they had a Jewish community, history says of about 100,000, and they had been forced to settle in that area during the reign of Ptolemy of Soter, around 300 to 285 BC. But there would have been an early center of Christianity there, as history tells us, and they had a synagogue present as well, so they would have been able to worship at the synagogue and celebrate annual feast. And so there would have been this community of Jews and then later Christians in this area. But as you mentioned, this man was, some versions may say pressed. He was, but he was forced by the Roman soldiers to carry Jesus' cross. But why is he mentioned? Why is it important that he is named the man that carries Jesus' cross? We'll get there. And then we come to the centurion in the cross, the man who saw Jesus breathe his last. And I put this up here just more, I found this interesting when I was preparing for this class, but there is a Christian legend that there was a centurion there at the crucifixion whose name was Longinus, which in the Greek word would have been Longchi, which means spear, and perhaps it may have been a nickname, but supposedly this centurion was blind. This man was responsible for piercing Jesus' side, and then the blood that fell from Jesus, the blood and water, fell on his eyes, and he regained his sight as a result of that. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. If you're blind, you'd have to have pretty good aim, or you're feeling around for a while to make sure you get the right spot. But whether this is that man or not, the man mentioned in the text in Mark and in Matthew 27 and verse 54, and we'll talk more about this statement here later, but made one of the truest statements, being truly this man was the Son of God. And why would he have made that statement? What would he have seen? What would have caused him to be able to make that statement? But we also know that Pilate even asked this man when Joseph of Arimathea came and asked for the body of Christ. And Pilate, kind of perplexed that Jesus was already dead, asked the centurion for confirmation, and the centurion gives that to Pilate. But once again, why, of all the characters that could have been mentioned, obviously his disciples and closest friends had scattered and weren't there at the cross. And there's probably a small number of people, as we read, who was at the cross. But why the centurion? And then we have Joseph of Arimathea. We talked about him a little bit a few classes back when we were speaking about Nicodemus. But Arimathea would have been up to the northwest. So Arimathea would be up here. Jerusalem is down here. And it would have been anywhere from 8 to 22 miles. It's probably closer to 20 to 22 miles northwest of Jerusalem. And there's, once again, very little that we know about Arimathea, or about Joseph, but we know that he was a rich man, as we see in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 57. He was a disciple of Jesus. He was a disciple of Christ. And as we talked about a few classes ago too, along with Nicodemus, is that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, so the Jewish Supreme Court, those 70 men made up of Sadducees and Pharisees and other chief priests in that Sanhedrin. And he's a man who feared, not in the sense of him respecting, but he was afraid. He feared the Jewish leaders, as we see in John chapter 19 and verse 38. we'll talk about why that's important here in a little bit, but once again, why do we need to know the man who buried Jesus? And what role did he have to play? I think it's worth taking just a minute to just mention the sovereignty of God when you're looking at these three different characters. Because nothing with God is random or accident when it comes to what is placed into the Gospels. But you wonder, what the sovereignty or the providence of God was in mentioning these three people. We know that he's Lord over creation and he exercises his rule in any way that he sees fit. And I want to briefly read these verses here, but in Revelation 4 and verse 11, "You are worthy, O Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they are created and have their being." Colossians 1:16, "For in him all things are created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him." Psalm 115 and verse 3, "Our God is in heaven, and he does whatever pleases him." Romans 11 verse 33, "Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments, and his paths beyond tracing out." And so, if you were Joseph of Arimathea, or if you're Simon of Cyrene, or you're the Roman, or you're the centurion standing at the cross, would you have ever imagined, all these centuries later, that you would be mentioned in the Bible? Would you have ever thought that your actions at that point in time would now be present in the Bible? And with that being said, now I want to take a deeper look into these three men and try and understand what is God's purpose of having them mentioned in the crucifixion story. So when we get to Simon of Cyrene, if somebody mentioned Simon of Cyrene as the first person they picked out after reading Mark 16, I would have been upset. Because I would have not expected that. But how many times do we read the crucifixion account and we're just like, oh yeah, this guy, Simon, he carried Jesus' cross. We kind of glance over it and then we move on, right? We move on to the next step, which is Jesus being at Golgotha and getting nailed to the cross. And as we read, Simon was forced into carrying Christ's cross. And we see John's account is a little different. John doesn't mention Simon. John just mentions Christ as carrying his cross, as it seems all the way to Calvary or Golgotha. But what do you think the significance is? And I've got some points I'll make up here, but what do you think is the significance of a Roman soldier forcing Simon, a foreigner, not even native to Jerusalem, to carry Jesus' cross?
The most practical part is like it illustrates how beat down Jesus was at this point.
Yeah.
He just couldn't even hear you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one other thing, though, is we always want to focus on Jesus and his disciples. We forget that Jesus affects everybody's lives. There's a story for everybody for Jesus. And so, in this case, it's Simon of Cyrene.
And that's probably one of my biggest points in this class is that Jesus affects everybody. It's not just the disciples. It's not just the people who we think of as being in the pillars of faith. He affects everybody. What else?
Well, it actually mentions
Rufus Alexander. It seems to be, the implication seems to be that these are people that the readers of this would have known.
Right.
And so, hey, their father was involved in this. So it's not so much to us, but to the initial readers, this gives it additional authenticity.
And if I remember correctly, it's only Mark's account that mentions Rufus and Alexander as being the sons of Simon of Cyrene. Any other thoughts?
As far as the service that you mentioned, kind of the randomness that affects people, it's just we're speculating. It does illustrate that sometimes what you're asked to do can be extremely unexpected, and seemingly random.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine, if you're Simon, who knows if he even knew once he got into Jerusalem that Jesus was going to be put on trial and crucified. He may have just heard there was a big uproar or there was a big event. He saw crowds gathering along the streets and wanted to just go and take a look and see what was happening. Maybe it was something as random as that, maybe not. It's just in preparing for the class, some speculate, because there is Cyrene mentioned later in Acts, I believe it is, some of the men of Cyrene, is that perhaps this moment in Simon's life would have driven him to become a presence, to become a figurehead in the first century church, promoting and further wanting to spread and build up the church back in Cyrene where he lived. We see Jesus once again being served, by a non-Jew, just like we talked about a couple of classes ago with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And Jesus we don't know what the interaction Jesus had with Simon. Obviously, there would have been a pass off of the beam, and you don't know if Jesus said, "Simon, thank you, for carrying this for me." But you see that he's served again by a non-Jew. Yes, ma'am.
And a few minutes ago, you told us about how large the Jewish community was there. How do you conclude? You have to forgive me. I'm getting senile in my old age. But how do you confirm that he was a non-Jew?
Well, maybe I shouldn't have put non-Jew. Just not native to Judea, perhaps. I don't know.
You'd think by the name of Simon
No.
that he
Perhaps.
would have been a Jew, because that was a Jewish name.
Well, strike that. Strike that. Anyways, but then if you look at Luke chapter 9 and verse 23, and if you want to turn over there, you can, but what a more visual lesson of taking up your cross daily and following me. And once again, I doubt Simon would have ever guessed that the day that he woke, or when he woke up that morning, that he would have been carrying a cross, period, but it would have been the cross of Christ that he would have been carrying. And so, also in this, you think about, and this is more of a broad lesson, more so than maybe the exact significance of the circumstances with Simon, but if you think about, Simon wasn't expecting to be in this situation. And so you see this sudden suffering. You can imagine that cross would have been heavy. That beam would have been heavy. All of a sudden you're getting a soldier come and grab you by the shirt and jerk you out into the street. And you're wondering, well, am I about to be killed as well? It's unexpected. You see the fear, the weight of the suffering that Simon is about to bear. It's painful. It seems random. It seems random, at least in the text. But as it was mentioned previously in Mark, with Rufus and Alexander as being mentioned as Simon's sons, and we'll mention them here in just a little bit as well. But you see this visual lesson of Luke 9 and verse 23 and the sudden suffering that we as Christians can deal with as well.
Seth, you think about the centurion, the effect that the way that Jesus died, the effect that had on the centurion. It's easy to imagine, and we don't know, I know it's speculation, but to imagine the effect that all this would have on Simon of Cyrene. If he were a Jew, he would already be a believer. So so to speak, and to follow Jesus down that path and carry his cross, it's not hard to imagine that he would have transmitted that to his sons, and that would have had an effect on not only Simon, but his sons and who knows who else. But
Well, imagine somebody in first century churches, what was it like there at the crucifixion? Go ask Simon. Go ask Simon. You know, what an amazing, first person account, because you can imagine he would have walked up the hill, even with that beam.
We tend to sterilize this a bit. We look at portrait of Jesus as he's being crucified. He has a little bit of blood running down his side and there's blood coming out.
Right.
He was a mess. This was not just a tidy job that he had to do. He was brought into, I guess people who work in trauma units get to see this kind of a mess and get to clean up bodies and have to get their hands dirty. Simon got his hands dirty that day. He ended up being, this was a total immersion kind of a job.
Yes. Jay.
I want to go back to your point about sovereignty of God. I believe that plays into all of this. These aren't random things. We might look at them as being that, but this is the plan of God. At any time, He knows my heart. He knows everybody's heart in the world. And those who are seeking Him will find Him. And I believe this is just a very good example of that very thing going on. God didn't, these people weren't randomly chosen. God had a hand in that.
Yes, 100%. You also think of,
I have one more thing to add. My best friend, she claimed this for the black community. She loved to point out that he was there. So she took a lot of, whether it's true or not, the fact that he was from Africa. It was a source of pride for her to be able to boast to me that they were included.
well, we know very little of Simon. I definitely don't know his skin color, so, or whether if he's a Jew or not, so. You think about, I fully would have expected if Jesus had fallen down under the weight of the cross, God would have still found a way to get him to Calvary to be crucified. But can you imagine from a Roman soldier standpoint, you see this man, like Darrell mentioned, this wasn't a trickle of blood. This was a man that had literally been torn, with thorns punched into his head with a rod. He had been beaten. He had been spat upon. This man, just in a 24-hour period, had gone through so much. But you imagine from a Roman soldier standpoint, what happens if Jesus dies on the way to Calvary? Well, first of all, I didn't discharge my full duty as making sure that Jesus got to the cross. Second of all, I'm probably going to have a lot of angry Jews that are saying, "What? Why didn't you? Why did he die on the way there?" And so you see Simon, helping Jesus, physically make it to the cross. And it's one of those things where, as I was studying this, and you go back to when Jesus is praying in the garden and asking for help, and you see where angels are helping Jesus, and you wonder if maybe even this is part of Jesus's prayer in the garden being answered, as far as being able to physically make it to the cross as well. And as we mentioned a couple of times already, that it's mentioned in Mark where he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, and we actually see another mention of Rufus. Now, whether this is the same Rufus or not, I don't think it hurts anything to believe that it is, but you see Rufus again mentioned in Romans 16 and verse 13, where he is being greeted as a choice man in the Lord, as well as his mother, also his mother-in-law. And so there's speculation that perhaps, Rufus and Alexander, Simon's sons, would have become some amazing missionaries for the first century church and what their father had witnessed, and then explaining to them, maybe his sons were even perhaps there at his side when he got pulled into and pressed into service. But you see that this had an effect to the following generation, perhaps, directly with Simon. So, once again, some speculation there, but I think that it would fall into the line of thinking of Simon was chosen for a reason. Then I want to get to the centurion at the cross. And I probably enjoyed studying the significance of why the centurion, would have been at the cross, because we've all, talked about Simon of Cyrene before, and we've already talked about Joseph of Arimathea. But outside of the trial, even the betrayal in the garden, and coming to trial, and then Jesus being beaten and mocked and having the crown of thorns pressed on his head, you don't really think about the Roman soldiers much beyond that. So I think it is somewhat unusual that we have a statement from a centurion, here in this text at the foot of the cross. When you think about, centurions, this would have been a man that would have had 80 to 100 people under his charge. You can imagine he would have been battle tested. He would have been hardened, war hardened. And you think about how many men he might have seen die, and many of them even by crucifixion. And so none of this would have been out of the ordinary at first glance for the centurion to witness somebody die. And he would have been probably very, very well trained in doing that. And you think about, was perhaps this centurion even involved with the capture and the trial and part of the torture of Jesus, like we'd already mentioned, where he'd been whipped and beaten, spat upon, he was mocked, crown of thorns pressed into his head. He had a robe placed on his raw, beaten back, and then pulled off, and then led down to Calvary. But, and you can turn, if you want to turn over to Matthew 27, verses 45 through 54. I'm not going to read that. I'm not going to read that in this text, or in this class right now. But if you think about the events, once Jesus has been nailed to the cross, what are some of the things that the centurion sees? What are some of the things that he witnessed?
Darkness.
He knows the darkness, the earthquake.
And I think what impacts him is he's probably witnessed a lot of death, but I'm sure he's never seen anybody shout out with a loud voice after
Yes.
what all Jesus has suffered.
You see, he shouts out, he hears Jesus shout out, my God, why have you forsaken me? What else does he see?
He sees him get be kind enough to think about his mother as he's dying.
Yeah, it's not mentioned in Mark, but he's passing off the care of his mom. He's worried about other people. We know from the text that one of the robbers could only think about himself. What else?
Jesus' prayer for forgiving the soldiers and all those that were responsible for his crucifixion.
Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And perhaps the centurion had been there during the trial even, and has already heard, all of the mocking and the lies and them, making these false accusations to Jesus, and he sees the dignity of the response of Jesus in this mock trial, whereas who else would ever be that dignified and humble in an instance like that? Anything else?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do we know, would there have been anyone in the temple when the curtain was torn? Would there have been anyone to have seen that?
I'm sure the some junior priest would have had to have stayed in the temple, but I don't know. Like, sorry, buddy, you drew the short straw. You don't get to go see the crucifixion. But I don't know the exact answer. It was either eyewitnessed or at some point somebody walked in and said, this happened.
Yeah.
So somebody was always in the temple,
Yes.
always.
But you even, how much of the centurion saw this, but you even read of the account where the tombs, some of the tombs were opened, and some of the bodies of the saints have been raised. And so,
He never saw the conversion of their soldier, and then Jesus approached him for a lot because of the,
yeah,
and he understood authority, he understood kingdom.
yeah. He might have heard him saying to the other thief, you know, today you will be with me in paradise. You know, hear those words. So if you're the centurion, and who knows how much knowledge you would have had of who this man Jesus was or what he was being, you know, crucified for. Let's say you have zero knowledge, really, or even just superficial knowledge of that. But then you're an individual who has just witnessed all of those events, even just from him being on the cross. What is going through your head at that point? And so the centurion, first of all, it says he was frightened, but then there's two different statements, or at least mentioned two different ways in Matthew and then in Luke. But says, truly, this was the Son of God. And there's, at least in my Bible, there's some debate on whether he actually recognizes Jesus as being the Son of God or just a Son of God. You know, this wasn't maybe necessarily a complete confession of faith. Maybe just an expression of the amazing awe of the events that he had just witnessed, and that this man was somebody different. But then claiming, certainly this man was innocent. And so we see that amazing declaration. And once again, after all the deaths that the centurion would have witnessed, this one was different, and I imagine would have stood out among all the ones that he had previously seen and probably all the ones that he would have witnessed thereafter. And there is absolutely nothing ordinary about it. Whether you look at the trial, you look at the execution and the death, you look at the power that this centurion and even those around would have seen, and then you see this extraordinary confession, this statement, you know, from the centurion. So, I guess the one thing that I thought about in preparing for this is, what is the significance of the centurion's statement? What is the significance of it coming from him? And what is the significance of the timing of that statement?
Well, the Jews refused to recognize, the Jews as far as the ones who were not believers, they refused to recognize Jesus as the Son of God. But this Gentile, this pagan, realizes he was the Son of God. Like you said, whether he was giving his life to him at that point, we don't know. But he did something that the chosen people would not do.
He used the title that the Jews mocked by to actually claim as being true. What else? What's the other significance?
Well, with him proclaiming that he's a righteous man, he's going against his leaders, because his leaders said he was guilty. When Pilate said he's guilty, he's going against his leaders, so therefore he can be punished for going against Pilate.
Right. Right.
Purely evidence-based. He didn't have a dog in the fight, whether Jesus was or wasn't. He didn't really know. He probably didn't have a whole lot of backstory. He would have known some of these things about this Jew that's in the area causing trouble. And then he's witnessed everything he has enough to be like, this was not a normal human being. This was, even if it was, this was the son of a god, because they had many. He identified something's different here.
Right.
Something's weird.
So much so that he says he praised God by his statement. So I think he took it a step further. Maybe he did just recognize that it was a son of a God, but it said he praises God. So in praising God, you're stating something a little more profound, I think, maybe.
Right.
But to what you said earlier, he was an expert. He's seen this before, so through expert's eyes, he could tell that this was different.
Yeah.
It also illustrates just that going back to the providence part of all this, that God doesn't need like his people, in air quotes, to really make a confession. He'll find somebody to confess truth.
Right.
And it's just remarkable of all the centurions are often portrayed in this unusually good light. We know they were bad as a whole, but the New Testament, Mark and others, really over and over again, really use him to use a centurion as leader of Satan's army to confess truth. And it's also a pretty literary book. Mark starts off with Jesus, the Son of God, and ends here with this confession.
Well, and the other thing that I was thinking about too is, obviously Paul, when he went to Rome, had some good stand, or was able to have some effect with preaching the gospel, even within, the Roman, with the other centurions, the Roman family. And you wonder, perhaps would this centurion have found his way back to Rome and have said, hey, I know what this guy Paul is talking about, and it is true. And how might that have affected what Paul, the impact that Paul would have had then too. I think you see Jesus most clearly as the promised Messiah at the cross. And then you see right away the power of the cross is being immediately recognized. And it's not to say that the centurion was necessarily the first, but it takes, anybody can appreciate and see the power of the cross. And so, but right away, immediately you see the power of the cross. Makes me think of a few verses in 1 Peter. Well, let's go to Galatians 2 and verse 20. It says, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In life I now live in the flesh. I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. 1 Corinthians 1:18, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Any other thoughts on that, on the centurion?
I mean, this echoes a couple things that have been said, but, the Holy Spirit in these writers of these Gospels, as you've noted, not just picking events at random. And Roman centurions, what they saw and what they expressed carry some weight, particularly to Greco-Roman audiences who have been like, okay, all this Jewish stuff. This is a way of letting, that's what I said, somebody who didn't have a dog in the fight initially, letting them speak to us thousands of years later, but also at that time to people who would have been suspicious of just sort of Jewish folklore.
Right.
Our example is powerful.
Yes.
And that, he is learning from Jesus' example. And sometimes we push that aside and we become kind of mouthy. But if we just live the life we're supposed to live, that is powerful.
Yes. Well, I don't have very much time left, so I'll throw all of these up here quickly. But Joseph of Arimathea, like we mentioned, he was a member of the Sanhedrin. It mentions that he actually had to muster up courage to go and ask Pilate for the body because he knew what was at stake. He puts his reputation on the line. He puts his life potentially on the line. Who's to say that the Jews would not have been mad at somebody from the Sanhedrin coming and taking Jesus' body down? Can you imagine being the one taking the nails out of Jesus' body? And as Julia had mentioned when we were talking with Nicodemus, that you are picking up Jesus' body, and it's a mangled body, and you are preparing for it. Do you think that Joseph even thought that when he went to Jerusalem for the Passover, that he was going to be the one to ask for Jesus' body and to care for him, and then to even put him in his grave, in his tomb? And so once again, you see Joseph standing up and making some sacrifices, and there again, divine design, placement, and timing, I think with all three of these men. So that's all I've got. Thank you.